So, this past weekend, I found myself in Boston for the wedding of my dear friend Ryan Ambrose. Congratulations to Ryan and Tiffany on your marriage. And this bar we ended up at both nights is called Hop and Scotch. And I've been to a lot of places in my life. I've worked in the service industry a very long time.
I mean, both of those things sound pretty good.
I've never been to a place where I know for a fact that their first marketing meeting was just looking at a board with a photo of me. No, the only way they can make this more appealing is if they called it Hop, Scotch, and Redheads. That was it.
Rob Scotch.
Oh, yeah,
Copyright.
really.
It's copyrighted. Don't even try to steal the idea.
Really, I thought I was going to die, and I realized there is such a thing as a good death. Well, speaking of death, we're going to talk about the death of a very, very famous pirate today. Everybody, welcome to Thieves, Rogues, and Renegades. My name is Rob North.
And I am your co-host, Chris Miller.
Chris, how are you feeling today?
If I was any better, I'd be twins.
Mm-hmm. Oh, God, two of you. That's really what we need. Okay, so today our subject is what?
Today we're going to talk about the Battle of Ocracoke Inlet.
Battle of Ocracoke Inlet. I seem to remember that. Now, we're coming up on a big anniversary for that, aren't we?
The big 300.
The big 300, the tricentenary. I think that's the word.
That sounds right.
Now, why is Ocracoke Inlet so important?
Ocracoke Inlet is so important because it marks what is generally accepted as the end of the golden age of piracy. It was the death of history's arguably most infamous pirate, Blackbeard.
Blackbeard himself.
Everybody's favorite pirate, and with good reason.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to talking about this today.
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a pretty important one.
It is.
Not just because of the anniversary, but this is kind of going to set the tone for all the episodes that come after.
Well, and we're talking about somebody who has such a massive amount of mythos built around him and this aura of mystery and extravagance and terror, and somebody who goes so far, even his representation into the realm of fiction, things like being portrayed by Ian McShane in Pirates of the Caribbean 11, whichever movie it was.
It was one of the 30.
Yeah, being portrayed by Ray Stevenson in Black Sails very well, might I add. I like that performance a lot.
My favorite.
So yeah, we're going to get to talking about that in a minute. Before we do that, I just want to thank everybody who listened to our preview episode that we put out a couple weeks ago, where we talked just kind of a little bit about us and what we're about and how we got here and why we're going to be doing what we're doing with this podcast. We want to thank you all for the feedback as well. I know we're working through some audio issues. We're figuring this out as we go. We're figuring out, our microphones, our software that we're using.
We did upgrade. We now have two microphones.
We now have two microphones. So we're high class.
For some reason, it's not going to sound like Rob is in a different room of my house.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. And everybody, please keep the feedback coming. We really appreciate it.
If you say anything about us on Twitter, I will block and report you.
Yes. We are kind of figuring this out, and you're seeing it, warts and all. So we appreciate you hanging in there. So our subject today, as we mentioned, is the death of Blackbeard, the 300th anniversary of the Battle of Ocracoke Inlet. This is not going to be heavily biographical about Blackbeard. We're going to do a bit of a short biography about him just to give you an idea of the background and how he got to the point where the Battle of Ocracoke Inlet was sort of a foregone conclusion. We are going to do a full biography of Blackbeard in the future. That's probably going to have to be a multi-part episode.
That's going to be at least 2 parts.
Absolutely.
Because he's so significant to what we're going to talk about and because he's just so damn fascinating.
And it plays into so many other things that were happening in this time period. So we have several sources today for this material, a lot of great books. I will post links to them on our social media pages so that you can go on Amazon. You can find the books if you are so inclined. We have Under the Black Flag by David Cordingley. It's a great look at just kind of piracy in general.
Yeah, it's the go-to book. Like, if you want to know anything about pirates, if you're interested in piracy, just pick it up. It's excellent.
It's a great kind of one-size-fits-all book for finding out sort of the truth of the life of the pirate and the privateer. The next book is The Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodard. I like this because it really goes into what I think was the most fascinating community in the world at this point, which was Nassau and this pirate stronghold that was declared their independence essentially from every major European power at this time, which Blackbeard ties into a lot, and so does a lot of the other figures mentioned in what we're going to talk about today. We also have Blackbeard, America's Most Notorious Pirate by Angus Constam. This is a really, really good one for looking at Blackbeard specifically. It's probably the best modern biography of Blackbeard, and it does a great job of portraying the event we're going to discuss today. The final one, and this one I love because of the contemporary nature of this source. It's called A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson.
We could do an episode just on that book.
Just on the book. It was
probably written by Defoe.
Yeah, they think that Captain Charles Johnson was actually a nom de plume, and they think it was actually Daniel Defoe who wrote Robinson Crusoe, who was actually a part of William Dampier's expedition, and we can go into that later. But it's great because it is somebody writing at that time. It's somebody writing only 6 years after the events of the Battle of Ocracoke Inlet. It's got a great style, a great literary flair. It can be a little melodramatic at times, but we've got a lot of great quotes from that book today.
Of everything from that era. It's just like reading it now, everything is just so it's so unintentionally hilarious.
It's great.
Where he took up the humors of piracy.
He really did.
It's so good. Just pick it up. It's amazing.
It is. So, Chris, I think we should move into a little bit about Blackbeard himself. A little bit of the story
it's hard not to. As much as we don't want this to be like just a Blackbeard episode, I mean, we are kind of going, what was it, Memento? We're going to start at the end. And we're going to, in a subsequent episode, we're going to talk about the beginning.
Yes, so what we're doing today is, this is the Cliff's Notes version of his life. So I'd say let's cast our minds back into the past as we don the skins to recreate the hunt. Well, maybe not that far. But so the thing about Blackbeard is his real name, what it exactly was, is not known to us. The most popular interpretation is Edward Teach, although a lot of people think he was actually called Edward Thatch, spelled about 3 different ways. Edward Thack, Edward Theach, Edward Tack, Edward Thatcher. The only thing they seem to agree on is that his first name was Edward.
Yeah, the dude's name was Ed, and we were just good with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's, for simplicity's sake, more often than not, we're just going to call him Blackbeard.
Or Teach. I'm going to go with probably the most popular.
Yeah, Teach is pretty well accepted at this point.
That's also 5 letters, and it's a lot quicker to type in all my show notes.
I like it.
So they think he was born sometime around the year 1680 near Bristol in southwest England. Bristol was the second largest city in England at this time. It was the primary trade port with West Africa and the Caribbean colonies. It's likely that he was from a family of means, and we know that he was literate, which was not actually all that common amongst pirate captains. Even in these positions of authority, a lot of these guys did not know how to read or write. Maybe they could do basic mathematics or what have you. Mostly it was just down to just sailor sense.
Yeah, guys signing with an X isn't just like a Hollywood trope. Like, that actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's likely that he went to sea at an early age. Pretty much everyone in Bristol who made a lot of money made it through maritime trade. And for the most part, they would send their sons off to sea at a pretty young age, sometimes as young as 9 or 10 years old, to get an idea of what the business was like. It was, the idea of the apprenticeship was central to just about every trade at this time in the Western world, and going to sea was no different. In your late childhood years, your early teen years, you were apprenticed to someone who knew the trade, who'd been in business a long time, and for somebody like Edward Teach, it meant going to sea on a merchant vessel. They think he became a privateer or a part of the Royal Navy in the service of the Crown during Queen Anne's War, which was the North American theater of the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714. This was a war that the English fought against the Spanish and the French and their allies. There's a bit of a problem with the idea that he was in the Navy, in that he was of means. If he joined the Navy, he would have joined as an officer trainee. And the Admiralty, even at this time, kept meticulous records, and there's nothing that corroborates the idea that he became a part of the Royal Navy.
Yeah, we were discussing this earlier. The closest thing they could find was a guy named Thomas Thatcher.
Mm-hmm.
and that was kind of the closest thing ever. But they did find that dude. So
Yeah.
we do know that he was turned out to be a separate person.
The likelihood that it's the same guy is extremely low. Privateers, of course, are not quite the same as pirates. Essentially, they do the same kind of thing. They hunt merchant shipping, they take goods, they capture ships, but they do it with what's called a letter of marque, which is a letter of permission from their home country, in this case, Queen Anne I of England, that basically says you have the crown's permission to go out and hunt enemy shipping. You will outfit your own vessel, you will crew your own vessel at your own expense. The only difference is a portion of what you take goes directly back to us.
Which, as it turned out for most privateers, was the lion's share of it.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be relatively unsurprising if you know anything about any of the monarchies of the era.
It depended on who was in charge. It depended on the dealers, the brokers, or even the speculators that you went through. It could be a way to become fantastically rich or a way to get utterly screwed.
Yes.
So the War of Spanish Succession was fought to prevent the unity of the French and Spanish crowns after the death of King Carlos II of Spain. Died with no legitimate heir, and he left the throne to Philippe, Duke of Anjou, grandson of the famed Sun King, Louis XIV. And the English basically declared war on them in order to preserve the balance of power in Europe and to preserve the strength of their trade. The alliances all joined up. It was kind of like the start of World War I. The war was fought on several fronts, Northern Europe and the Low Countries, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, the Rhineland, but it was really the first European war in which the various powers' colonies in North America would play a significant role. And although fighting in the colonies was nothing new, there's this idea of no peace beyond the line, which is a pretty common phrase in use at the time, and that was that raiding, privateering was always happening on a low scale amongst the colonies. So it's basically just an escalation of those same sorts of activities. They think that Teach spent most of the War of Spanish Succession sailing from Jamaica under various privateer captains, and according to Captain Charles Johnson, he hath oft distinguished himself for his uncommon boldness and personal courage, end quote. So we think he was pretty good at what he did, and by the end of the war in 1714, he was in the service of a privateer captain who later became a pirate, and even later then, a pirate hunter, a fellow by the name of Benjamin Hornigold, who we will definitely get to in future
that's going to be
episodes, probably.
An episode.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime these guys start changing sides, now we really got to jump on that one. Hornigold's a fantastic story.
Absolutely. After the end of the war, Teach went with Hornigold to the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. It was a largely uninhabited island at the turn of the 18th century, until a fellow named Henry Jennings, who was also a privateer, who went pirate, turned it into a temporary base. It had a harbor that could safely house dozens, if not hundreds of vessels, but was really too shallow for the Royal Navy's larger vessels to navigate. It was also close to most of the busy shipping lanes off the coast of Florida and in the Caribbean. Author George Woodbury describes it as no city of homes. It was a place of temporary sojourn and refreshment for a literally floating population. And he continues, the only permanent residents were the piratical camp followers, the traders, and the hangers-on. All others were transient. So you have this massive pirate camp that grows over the course of the early 18th century and later turns into the Pirate Republic of Nassau, the settlement referred to in Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodard.
Yeah, if you think it sounds fun, it was.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's exactly what you think. They're like Disney kind of got it right in the ride, the Pirates of the Caribbean, like with all the carousing and drinking. That's pretty much how it started.
I think we would have had a great time there, and it also would have scared the absolute shit out of us at the same time.
Yeah, like it was completely lawless. It was, you just had to hope that people who stab people for a living did not want to stab you.
Mm-hmm. So Teach began operating as either the quartermaster or the second mate of Hornigold's crew out of New Providence, and in the summer of 1716, he was given the command of his first vessel. It was a small sloop, which is a shallow draft trading vessel, a small ship, normally with a single mast, very simple rig, and he began to operate with Hornigold as part of a small pirate flotilla. They embarked on a cruise around the southern mainland of the U.S., taking at least 10 vessels. These are the ones that are on record, between the northern coast of Cuba and southern Virginia. And it was actually during this cruise that Teach is first mentioned in the records, in British records, this being from a report made by a Captain Matthew Month after an anti-piracy patrol. It's a small entry. It just says, a Captain Thatch, operating a sloop of 6 guns and some 40 men. That's it. So he continues to go to sea as part of Hornigold's flotilla. September 1717, Teach and Hornigold are joined by a fella named Major Steed Bonnet.
Oh, it's your boy Steed!
Your boy Steed!
I'm so excited about the next one.
We're going to talk about him next time, and that's... I'm going to be calling him Captain Bumblefuck for a reason.
So prepare yourselves for that one.
Yes. So Steed Bonnet was a rich landowner and military officer from Barbados who basically turned pirate on a lark. We'll get into all the reasons why next time.
And some reasons why those reasons might have been bullshit.
Maybe.
As I've been finding out, like some of these do start to make sense. It's chipping away at everything I've ever known about Steed Bonnet, but I still think that he's just a lovable bonehead.
Yeah, that's true. We're still going to talk about them, though, because it makes for a fun story.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that's going to be a lot of fun to discuss. So Bonnet outfits a sloop called the Revenge, throws 10 guns on it, crew of 70 men, all at his own expense, but his crew's extremely dissatisfied with his command.
Yeah, this is not piracy par for the course. Like, he bought a boat and bought all the guns, and then he bought a crew.
Well, it's not really piracy. It is.
It's not.
No, it's an improv sketch disguised as piracy. Del Close would have loved this because this guy just yes-anded his way
This is like what happens
into being a
whenever
pirate captain.
You see all these videos online of like some hyper-rich 18-year-old YouTube star buys like a brand new Ferrari.
Yeah,
it ends like on a guardrail or a telephone.
He's every kid on Instagram that you hate.
Yeah, pretty much.
He's every kid on Instagram that you hate.
Pretty much.
So what ends up happening is essentially
we're gonna get sidetracked by this one, and we can't go down this route.
We gotta move on.
Up for you.
We gotta move on. So what happens now is what we touched on this last time. We've got the management review from hell. Now this is with Bonnet's permission, but Edward Teach then
we use the word permission lightly.
Yeah. He moves over to the Revenge to take command in Steed Bonnet's place to basically go, all right, listen, idiot, this is how it's done. And so you're Steed Bonnet, you're this rich idiot, this absolute fop who has no idea what he's doing, and this big, scary, bearded, salty sea dog is looking over your shoulder the whole time. The whole time.
It's amazing. I'm going to work on like a Steed Bonnet voice for the next one, and I'm not sure which way I'm going to go with it, but I think I'm kind of nailing one down.
Every instinct is telling me Stewie Griffin.
It's going to be a little higher pitched than that.
I will.
It's good. Yeah, but I'm not going to break it out now. I'll practice on my own time.
I will do my level best not to channel Seth MacFarlane any more than I already do. So trouble starts to brew amongst this flotilla. Benjamin Hornigold, he had a habit of only attacking the ships that were Britain's old enemies, the French, the Spanish, to an extent the Danish, the Saxons, the list goes on. But Teach and a lot of the men in the flotilla were really dissatisfied at all the rich English vessels that were sailing right by. And soon they all took a vote and demoted Hornigold. They basically said, yeah, you're not our leader anymore. This guy Teach, we're gonna follow him now. He's gonna lead us now.
We like what this guy's selling.
Yeah, you can stay with us or not. And Hornigold decided not to. He actually, at that point, retired from piracy and returned to take command of Nassau's defenses, and soon took a mass royal pardon that was offered by a fellow who was a privateer who then turned pirate hunter, a guy named Woodes Rogers, who, that's a multi-parter that's coming in the future too.
Yeah, that's a really compelling story.
Mm-hmm. So Teach sets off with the Revenge and another ship, and this is where his career really begins to take off. And he starts showing up more and more and more in the records. 28th of November, 1717, off the coast of the island of St. Vincent, Teach's 2 vessels approach a large French merchantman with 26 guns on it. The ship is called La Concorde. He hove to alongside her, he fires a broadside, he boards the French vessel, forces the captain to surrender both the ship and its cargo of slaves. Teach then sails to the small island of Bequia, puts what slaves he didn't recruit to his own crew ashore, gives the French crew the smaller of the 2 sloops he already had, which they named La Mauvaise Rencontre. You'll have to excuse the pronunciation there.
Gesundheit.
But, thank you. Answering my bad French with German. Which means bad meeting. So, pretty apropos.
Yeah, it's nice to have a sense of humor whenever you're marooned on a tiny island.
So they take La Concorde, they then convert it into their own flagship. They put a whole bunch of additional cannons on this thing, bringing the total to, depending on the source, anywhere between 40 and 48. With that, Teach is now in command of the most heavily armed pirate vessel, probably not just in the Caribbean, probably in the entire Western Hemisphere. It's more than a match for any Royal Navy vessel that is in the Caribbean at that time. Their station in Jamaica has 6 warships, the largest of which has 32 guns. Now, anything they're going to send down that can outgun this ship, it can outrun.
Yeah, they'll never catch it.
And this ship really has gone down in history, oftentimes just because of the name they gave it. The name of that was the Queen Anne's Revenge.
Yeah, that's a pretty badass nickname for the dude that made his bones in the...
Fighting for Queen Anne.
Yeah, fighting for Queen Anne in the wars.
Fighting for Queen Anne. And so after the acquisition of the Queen Anne's Revenge, he begins to really step up the rates of his acts of piracy. And in the 6-month span between November of 1717 and May 1718, he captures at least 20 ships, adds at least 7 more ships to his flotilla, giving him the command of some 400 men and 10 ships. And this is the time when Teach starts to adopt the cognomen of Blackbeard. It's first mentioned in a deposition of a fellow named Edward Bostock, caption of a merchant sloop named Margaret, which describes Teach as, quote, a tall, spare man with a very black beard, which he wore very long. Charles Johnson also describes him thus: so our hero, Captain Teach, assumed the cognomen of Blackbeard, from that large quantity of hair which, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there in a long time. This beard was black, which he suffered to grow of an extravagant length. As to breadth, it came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons in small tails after the manner of our Ramillies wigs, and turn them about his ears.
Can we talk about how whenever the dude wanted to look badass, he put ribbons in his hair?
Mm-hmm.
But it worked. Like
yeah.
He pulled it off.
Oh, yeah.
Like the powdered wig. Like it may not translate today, but this dude with little bows and his giant beard.
Well, just because you're trying to scare people doesn't mean you can't look like a baller when you do it.
Hey, if you look good, you play good. If you play good, they pay good.
You good. He also...
Prime time. Anytime I can shoehorn Deion Sanders into this podcast, you bet your ass I'm gonna. So, Teach also, at this point, in this period, began to develop his appearance in battle. It was going to bolster his reputation and also to avoid unnecessary fights. So he starts to use his appearance and his behavior to demoralize opponents who did choose to resist. The less fights you have, the less men you lose, the easier it is to take over the enemy vessel. This is basically an understanding of psychological warfare. It's shock and awe is really what it is. I'm going to quote Charles Johnson again here to describe his appearance in battle. Quote, such a figure that imagination cannot form, an idea of a fury from hell to look more frightful. Teach was tall, with broad shoulders. He wore knee-length boots and dark clothing, topped with a wide hat and sometimes a long coat of brightly colored silk or velvet. And he continues. He wore in battle, quote, a sling over his shoulders with 3 brace of pistols, that's 6 pistols, hanging in holsters like bandoliers, and stuck lighted matches under his hat, the latter to emphasize the fearsome appearance he wished to present to his enemies. Now, this is a guy who knows what society he's in, which is a very religious and a very superstitious society. And you have people who they don't have television, they don't have films. Most of these guys have never even seen a realistic painting. They've seen these woodcuts and they've heard these stories of the demons that they are convinced stalk the world they live in. And this ship approaches. You hear this din of drums and trumpets and men shouting and screaming and firing flintlocks into the air. And all of a sudden, this guy who resembles every story you've ever heard about the devil himself leaps onto the deck of your ship. How would you react? Yeah, it definitely definitely persuaded a lot of guys to not take that shot, to not draw that sword. Blackbeard, as good as he was, as effective as he was at capturing prizes, many of the times he didn't have to fire around.
No.
Just the sight of him had people giving up.
Taken without cannon shot, without casualties. And you know, you're this merchant sailor that's basically paid a pittance to defend some rich asshole's goods that you can't afford, and somebody puts a flintlock in your hands and says, "Fight to the death to defend this." Bullshit, you're going to do that.
I'm out.
Nope, you throw it down and you let this guy do what he will. The next major episode in Teach's career is one of my favorites. He takes his fleet and he posts himself up outside of the port of Charlestown, which is now Charleston, South Carolina, and then proceeds to blockade the largest port in the southern English colonies. They capture the town's pilot boat, they capture 9 other merchant ships, and a fellow named Samuel Wragg, W-R-A-G-G, a member of the Province Council. He's basically the equivalent to a state senator. And they use these captives and these ships as a bargaining chip, and they use Wragg as a go-between to bargain with the colony's government for medical supplies. And maybe this is an apocryphal story, but supposedly it was stuff to treat syphilis.
Yeah, in Nassau there was a massive outbreak, and they weren't sure what the sickness was. Yeah, it was syphilis. Unsurprisingly, it was syphilis.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if that actually is a true story, apocryphal though it may be. Teach succeeded in having his demands met. They gave him these chests of medical supplies. He releases the captives, acquired both their valuables and goods from the captured vessels, and just sails away. Now, going back to the Queen Anne's Revenge, it has such a place in pirate history. The thing about the ship is Blackbeard only hung on to it for 9 months?
Maybe.
9 months? Yeah, he barely used it, because when you have such a big vessel like that, it becomes a liability. You become a lot easier to track down. You become a lot easier to find. Yeah, you have a much bigger target painted on your back.
Pirates were as successful as they were because they didn't have to go toe-to-toe with the Navy. They avoided the Navy at all costs.
Yeah.
So these guys used hit and run, small boats.
If you can't outgun them, outrun them.
Yeah, and a lot of these pirates, you think, Blackbeard with a 40-gun brigantine. That was not the case. These were sometimes 2-masted sloops, sometimes 1-masted sloops with between 4 and 8 guns.
A lot of them didn't even have cannons.
Right.
We'll do an episode about what most pirate ships were like. So, Teach lost the Queen Anne's Revenge intentionally, according to some sources, when it ran aground on a sandbar at Beaufort Inlet, the entrance to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Cracked her mainmast, damaged her keel. And given that whilst he was blockading Charlestown, they'd heard of the approach of Woodes Rogers and his fleet of large warships, he appears to have made the decision to abandon the Queen Anne's Revenge, disband a large portion of his crew, basically to become more mobile, making himself and what men and ships he kept with him easier to hide amongst the shallows and shoals and inlets of the Outer Banks. His flagship at this point becomes a sloop named Adventure. So this is the time when, we mentioned Woodes Rogers, the British government offers a blanket pardon of pirates in order to stem the tide of attacks and shipping losses. They offer this in conjunction with Woodes Rogers' expedition, and the main intent of it was to break up the Pirate Republic of Nassau. If you can't beat them, forgive them, and turn them to your side.
I think the most important thing that we kind of skipped, and it's just dawning on me now, the reason why piracy was considered such a heinous crime is because it fucked with their wallet. Because it disrupted shipping.
Yeah.
That was really the only reason. Like, they didn't really care about the murder. Like, honestly, the quality of life aboard a pirate ship was probably better than one in the Navy.
Oh, or your average merchant ship.
Right.
Absolutely, by far. And that's stuff that we will discuss at length later.
The Navy was disease. It wasn't pirates. It wasn't other navies.
Yeah.
It sucked. But that's why the Crown had such a hard-on for pirates.
Yeah.
It's because that was their bread and butter.
Yeah, it wasn't the idea that these guys were killing a lot of people. It's the idea of all these fat asses in periwigs at Lloyd's just grabbing their head and going, what do we do? So we have Woodes Rogers sailing in. We have this opportunity for a pardon, and Teach is interested, so he's not going to risk his own neck in case it's a bluff. Who does he send?
Our boy,
Stede Bonnet. He sends Stede Bonnet to meet with the governor of the Carolina colony, a fellow named Charles Eden.
And I think I convinced Rob to do an episode on Charles Eden because this dude's the man.
It's
like, I have never identified with a character more than this dude.
I love Charles Eden. He is as corrupt as it gets. Look, we're going to have an entire episode devoted to this guy. I cannot wait to talk about it. I can't dwell on it now. But, so, they send Stede Bonnet to meet with Charles Eden in Bath, North Carolina. Bonnet receives a full pardon, returns to collect his ship, only to find that Blackbeard has stripped the ship of everything of value and marooned all the men on one of these little islands in the Outer Banks. At this point, now that he's pissed off, Stede Bonnet
up his car and left.
This is the equivalent of breaking up with somebody and leaving all their shit on the front lawn.
Yeah.
So,
like every relationship I've ever had, ever.
Look, if you're going to pay me $50 an hour to talk about this, we'll talk about this. Otherwise, we'll have to wait. So, Stede Bonnet acquires another ship, announces his return to piracy, and of course this gets to Governor Eden, and it gets up to all the other colonies in the southern United States.
He did swear solemn revenge against Blackbeard. Which probably not the best idea.
No. He sought out Teach to try to take his vengeance. Well, word gets out that he's about to set sail and he's returning to piracy.
Spoiler alert.
They just put a warship in the Cape Fear River that he's sailing out of. They capture him, and he goes to the hangman's noose.
Yep.
We will talk about that at length next time.
That's also a funny story. There is a daring prison break involved.
There is, and it's a daring prison break with yakety sax playing in the background.
Right.
It's dumb, but it's fun. So, Teach, knowing what he's found out from Stede Bonnet, proceeds to Bath, receives a full pardon from Governor Eden, settles in Bath, marries the daughter of a local landowner, which, according to Charles Johnson, is his 14th wife.
But it is also the only one that is recognized.
Yes, the only one named. He tries his hand at running a plantation, and turns out he either sucks at it or he hates it, or some combination of the two.
It sounds from the stories like it was a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it might have been a combination of the two. So, within 2 months of settling in Bath, he returns to piracy. He goes back to his ships that are anchored in the Outer Banks. He takes a pair of French vessels leaving the Caribbean, takes one of them back to Ocracoke with him, and goes to Governor Eden and claims that he found the ship abandoned at sea. So they convene an admiralty court with a guy named Tobias Knight, who's the royal secretary, presiding over it. He finds that the ship was indeed derelict at sea, and Teach is cleared of all wrongdoing, which had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that out of the ship's cargo, 20 hogshead barrels of sugar were awarded to Tobias Knight, and 60 hogsheads of sugar to Governor Eden.
It should also be noted that whenever he went to Eden for the pardon, the ship that he was on, all of a sudden, had no cargo.
No cargo.
Turns out there was no cargo at all.
No, nothing on it at all.
It was all gone.
Nothing on it at all.
Also, the man, Governor Eden, who had a tunnel from his basement to a riverbank, which he swears up and down was just to get to the river, and it wasn't so he could smuggle in goods and hang out with pirates.
Well, sometimes you got to be efficient at getting to that early morning fishing. I'd like to point out at this point that 60 hogsheads of sugar is worth over $50,000 in today's money. And Teach gets to keep what remains after these little payouts under rights of salvage. So, Teach treads a gray area in this period where he's kind of being a pirate, kind of still a plantation owner, keeps his ships anchored in Ocracoke Inlet, settling on land, travels to the anchorage frequently, though, and at times he's playing host to other pirates like Jack Rackham, Charles Vane, Robert Deal, all of these guys who are being pursued by Woodes Rogers' naval forces, and they're having parties on the beach.
Yeah, the locals really like it. This is the last colony that really abolished piracy. Piracy was kind of seen as like a fashionable vice.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, piracy was kind of like the cocaine of like 17, 18.
It was sexy.
Yeah.
It was sexy to these guys.
Yeah.
However, with all good times comes the buzzkill. Enter Alexander Spotswood.
That's going to do it for part 1 of the YouTube edition of our episode 2 Battle of Ocracoke Inlet episode of our podcast series. If you want to follow us, stick around for part 2 of episode 2, where we're going to get into what the arrival of Alexander Spotswood means, which essentially is him setting into motion the events that are going to ultimately culminate in the Battle of Ocracoke Inlet, which, after all, is why you bought your ticket. It's why you're here in the first place. So stick around for that one. In the meantime, be sure to hit the subscribe button in the bottom corner there so that you never miss any of the things we upload. We will be putting some new stuff on YouTube, not necessarily just episodes of the podcast, so be sure to follow us on there for some new and exciting stuff, and we'll see you next time.